Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the third session of certificate course in dialogue study. Today, we have the privilege of having Dr. Kerim Balci with us. Kerim Balci is a writer, journalist, academic, and human rights activist of Turkish origin. He's recently the chief advisor of London-based human rights dialogy and works as a communication officer at London Advocacy, a litigation-based human rights advocacy firm. He served as the editor-in-chief of Turkish Review and as columnist to today's Zaman and Zaman dailies before these publications were shuttered by the Turkish government. Dr. Balci is B in physics and political science at Bogazici University, Turkey. His A in Islam and modern Middle East at the Hebrew University, Jerusalem, and his PhD on linguistics at Durham University, UK. He is currently an LL student at Leeds Law School, UK. You're welcome, Dr. Balci.
Thank you, Basant.
Over to you. You can begin.
Dear friends, esteemed professors, today I'm going to be speaking about a particular philosophical concept on dialogue. This is a rather Western approach to any kind of study. Those people who are in the eastern part of the world or who do have a religious conviction usually do not need to ground any kind of practice onto a philosophical background, but usually they use their religious or conviction-based texts. So if you are a Hindu, the Vedantic text, the Upanishads, provide you with enough information and encouragement and incentive about dialogue. If you are a Muslim and if you believe in dialogue, you will certainly find enough information or enough encouragement in the holy text of Islam, the Quran, or in the beautiful life story of the Prophet. So usually people with a religious conviction, they ground their practice onto their holy text, whereas starting from the Enlightenment in the Western Hemisphere, the grounding moved away from religious traditions and moved towards philosophical traditions. Today I'm going to do something in between. I'm going to try to ground the necessity of dialogue or need to dialogue or the beneficial effects of any dialogic activity onto both philosophical and a bit of Christian religious texts. Well, my guide in this presentation is going to be a Russian philologist named Mikhail Bakhtin. I'm going to refer to some other philologians and philosophers from the Western hermeneutics traditions, names like Heidegger, Emmanuel Levinas, Gadamer, and similar names will pop up during my presentation, but I'm going to try to keep this at the level of layman, knowing that you are not trained into philosophy, and the aim of this overall module is not to teach philosophy, but to teach the practice and activity side of dialogue. But we always need this grounding. As I said, now I am also, as a Muslim, I'm giving lectures about the Islamic grounding or basis of interfaith, intercultural dialogue. But today I'm not going to deal with that part. I'm going to deal with a philosophical approach to dialogue. The term dialogical imagination was never used by Mikhail Bakhtin. Mikhail Bakhtin is, as I said, a Russian philolog that lived in the 20th century largely, and that produced most of his publications in late 1920s to late 1940s, despite the fact that after a lengthy period of stopping to write anything in 1971 and 73, a few years before he passed away, he produced some scribblings, I would say, not books, but some reviews of previous books and also some notes for a future ambitious project about a new methodology of human sciences or social sciences, if you wish to use the term. And I'm going to touch what he was up to there. Unfortunately, I'm going to use already a term that we will learn today. His project was never finalized. It was an unfinalizable project, and this actually enriched Mikhail Bakhtin's philosophy, and Bakhtinian studies turned into a kind of industry in the West that reaches from pedagogy to sociology, from movie science to communications and so on. Bakhtin himself was thinking that he was doing some kind of literary critique. He was certainly, his career started as a critique of Dostoevsky's and Rabelais books. His PhD, never accepted PhD, was written on books of Rabelais, the 16th century French author, novelist. And he dealt with some of the books of Gogol and Tolstoy also in his literary critique articles. The amazing thing in Bakhtin and how Bakhtin became relevant for any kind of study you would make in a Western university on dialogue, whether it is, say, a PhD on peaceful conflict resolution through dialogue, you will have to touch Mikhail Bakhtin. Or if you wish to study certain replics of dialogues in a Hollywood or Bollywood made movie, you will have to refer to Bakhtin. Bakhtin became such a huge name, particularly after 1980s, because those were the years his major books started to be translated first to French and later on to English. There was a, mismanagement of Bakhtin's books. His latest books were translated into French earliest, and the translators were mainly Marxist intellectuals, so they loved to read Bakhtin from a Marxist perspective, whereas Bakhtin himself belonged to an Orthodox religious movement. Actually, he was jailed in early 1920s because of his religious conviction under the newly established Bolshevik anti-religious regime in Russia. In anyhow, Bakhtin does have connotations of a neo-Kantian, does have connotations of Marxist aesthetics, but he is unique on his own. I'm not going to teach everything about Bakhtin today. In fact, it is impossible to teach everything about Bakhtin because Bakhtin is unfinalizable. So it's a big event that is becoming. We still do not know what Bakhtin is all about because even in the last 10 years, new pieces of articles were aired that were written by Bakhtin, but because of security situation under Soviet Russia, they were published under different names and so on. So the event of Bakhtin is actually still going on. In anyhow, I'm going to touch a few concepts, dialogism versus monologism, I am going to touch the text that is carrying its context in itself, and the term utterance instead of sentence, as Bakhtin would love it. I'm going to touch how a literary critical study moved into philosophy and later on moved on into hermeneutical sciences, where, for example, nowadays, any biblical hermeneutician, commentary, needs to refer to Bakhtin in order to better understand the Bible. Very recently, Quranic interpreters also started to utilize some of the methodologies fully developed later on, not by Bakhtin, but by the students of Bakhtin's in 1990s and early 21st century. So in anyhow, I'm going to touch how that philological or literary critique study moved into other areas of our understanding. As I said, my presentation will be dealing mainly with major concepts from Bakhtin's oeuvre. I'm going to touch the dialogic imagination. This term was never used by Bakhtin himself. It is actually a posthumous formulation of Bakhtin's overall understanding of the role of an author and the role of a reader and the role of the heroes within the novels or any kind of literary creation. Well, many people, when it comes to studies on dialogue, or when it comes to studies on communications, let me say, many people have studied real human situations, and then from there they moved into literary criticism. For example, they said normal human beings do this and that, but in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, we find Raskolnikov doing this and that. So the direction of mobility is from real life conditions into representations, into literary representation of the real life conditions. In the case of Mikhail Bakhtin, the move is on the reverse. He studied first Crime and Punishment. He studied first the literary representations of life, and from there he reached an understanding of the ideal. For example, in Dostoevsky's books, and particularly in Crime and Punishment, Bakhtin realized a term he would code either as heteroglossia, we will learn what it is today, or polyphony, a multitude of voices that mix and usually resist, if not revolt, to the authoritative voice of the narrator and the author. And Bakhtin said, in fact, occasionally heroes like Raskolnikov and others are actually resisting to the idea or to the overall project of the author, Dostoevsky. In fact, he goes to Dostoevsky's own letters to his friends, where Dostoevsky, in fact, complains about Raskolnikov, that Raskolnikov no longer listens to him, no longer does what he wants him to do while writing Crime and Punishment. Bakhtin realizes that this was the ultimate perfection of literary representation, and then from there he moved into real life situations. So he said, if we find the ultimate perfection of human communication as a multitude of voices never silenced by others in a novel, then let us call this novel as dialogic novel. And from there he moves into real life conditions and says, just like that, we should never silence the voices of others. And just like Dostoevsky has created the dialogic atmosphere in the communications in his novels, we should have dialogic communications in our real life. So the mobility is not from the real life situations to the literary representation, but from the literary representation towards the real life situation. But I have to underline, in Bakhtin's understanding, what we call real life situation is not anything other than a written text. In Bakhtin's understanding, the life, the universe as itself is a written text. If you are familiar with the Augustinian concept of book of universe, which actually permeated into Islamic understanding of the universe also, the whole universe is a letter written by God to the human beings. So this life, human beings, the universe, the galaxies, and so on, they are all written words. They are signs of God that are telling us certain messages. And since it is a book also, the real life is actually a written book, then there is nothing wrong in moving from a written book written by Dostoevsky to a written book written by God, and learning something from one of them and applying those learned things to the other. There is nothing wrong in that. In fact, this is not unique to Bakhtin. Already at the heydays of Enlightenment, names like Diderot, the early creator of encyclopedia tradition in France, believed that the language is actually not a representation of life, it is the life. And he believed, for example, in encyclopedia, he writes, if you want to change anything in the real life situation, start with the language. This is quite Marxist. Later on, of course, Marx came and endorsed the idea of language being the real life situation. And we can find this in Mikhail Bakhtin. Bakhtin has written on Dostoevsky's novels. He has written lengthy articles like epic and novel. He has written lengthy book, actually several rewriting of a book about the novels of Rabelais, where he developed his concept carnival or carnivalesque. Let me move into the major concepts that I am going to be speaking. The first concept that Bakhtin introduced into literary studies or literary critics is dialogism versus monologism. In Bakhtin's understanding, of course, at the early stages, he was just reading Dostoevsky, and he was trying to compare Dostoevsky's books, or let me say, books written after Goethe and books written before Goethe, like in the Greek antiquity and so on. And he realizes that the books written in the antique Greek antiquity or Roman antiquity were all written by a tone of monologism. In fact, when we look at the Greek theatrical text and so on, we find a lot of dialogues. We find the heroes speaking to each other and so on. But, Bakhtin says, until the time of Goethe and Shakespeare, or Francis Bacon, we do not find real dialogue. So in Bakhtin's understanding, the fact that people are speaking to each other in a matter of dual speech, this doesn't mean dialogism. This might be a dialogue, but it is not dialogic in essence. What is dialogic? Dialogic is it has several layers of explanation. At the very initial layer, it is an atmosphere of free communication where no voice is silenced. And in fact, the voice of the author should not be heard in a dialogic communication if the reader starts to realize that he is being preached by an author who has a dominant voice, and in fact, the author's voice can be heard behind each and every hero's voice. That is not dialogism, that is monologism. Everybody is actually a representation or instantiation of the author speaking. And when you look at the poetry, for example, Bakhtin is largely a critic of poetry because he believes that in poetry, it's almost impossible to be dialogic, because in poetry, the author's voice is a dominant voice. Bakhtin is not against poetry. It says, just categorizing. This is a monologic communication. The lyric poetry of Greek antiquity or early Christianity, for example, are totally monologic because the author believes that he has or she has already reached to ultimate perfection. He knows what is the truth. He never hesitates. He never has a question mark in his mind. He doesn't change his mind and so on. He stays always the same, and he preaches that ultimate reality to the humanity. In fact, most of the religious texts are monologic naturally because they came from, or people believe that they came from, the ultimate authority. God knows everything at the best level, so God does not hesitate. God does not have any kind of a possibility of change during the revelation and so on. We don't expect to see a God that changes his own character throughout the revelation. If you find such a text, then you will find a dialogic text. Bakhtin moves into an upper level of dialogism. As I said, the first level is an atmosphere of free communication where no voice is silenced. The second, for example, if I continue on speaking all day today and never give you an opportunity to speak, that means your voices are silenced. But, Bakhtin says, there's another way where a communication is totally from one person towards others. It can still be dialogic if the person takes into consideration the listeners, takes into consideration, for example, in my case, I know that I'm speaking to an largely Indian, Bangladeshi, Afghani audience, and I am trying to refer to the texts that are familiar to my audience. If I refer to Vedas and also to Quran, looking at the names and so on, half Muslim, half Hindu, that is an attempt to dialogize the communication. If I manage also to control, to look into your eyes, and from the expressions in your eyes, read what the level of your interest, whether you are already lost or not. I hope you are not, because we are going to have more mazes in front of us. Then that is an attempt towards dialogizing also. If I know some of you already, and if I know some of the kind of questions that might come into your mind, and if I start referring to those questions even before you ask them and give their answers, that is another attempt towards dialogizing the overall text. Of course, then we will have the question, who owns the text? Who created this text? If, for example, I'm looking at, Junaid Nalimi's face now, and I'm saying, well, he seems to be listening to me. Okay, let me continue on. Junaid has already a right to claim that some of this text is actually created by Junaid, because I took something from his eyes and added that into my speech, or formalized my speech accordingly. So that brings about the multitude of voices in a text that is preached by only one single person. In fact, in holy text, we usually uh, hear the sound of, despite the fact that it is revealed by, say, a Lord, we hear the sound of Satan, or we don't only read Christ in the Bible. We hear the sound of the Antichrist. We hear the sound of the enemies of Christ, and so on. Of course, the students of Christ also. So a multitude of voices penetrate one person's speech, and that is a level of dialogic communication. Bakhtin also moves into a further level of dialogism, where the hero himself changes, and he gives the example of Bildungsroman. Bildungsroman is largely referred to Goethe and any kind of German novelistic production after Goethe. The critical thing in Goethe's writings is, for the first time in Western novel writing, the heroes started to change throughout the novel. When you look, for example, to early adventure novels of Greek antiquity, like Sinbad, for example, or similar things that you know from your own stories, did you ever find Sinbad getting old, for example? You know, he goes to thousands and thousands of adventures and turns back the same Sinbad. He always wins, never loses his, courage, and so on. Even if he might have difficulties on the way, from the very beginning, all of the readers already have utmost belief that what will happen. Well, actually, this is quite common in Bollywood movies also. You know, the hero is a hero at the very beginning of the movie and is the hero at the end. Very rarely, and in only recent experiences in Bollywood, we started to see heroes turning into non-heroes or even anti-heroes in the movie. Usually we don't like such movies because we usually identify ourselves with the hero and we want the hero to win. But Bildungsroman is actually where in real life conditions human beings change. Why doesn't the hero in our movies, in the Turkish movies, for example, the hero stays always the hero and very rarely loses in the end of the movie? That is monologic, says Bakhtin. In real life conditions, human beings change. Human beings have problems. Human beings lose their faith in their causes and so on, give up sometimes. And it doesn't work like the Turkish movies. And in Bildungsroman, we see how the heroes evolve from, say, I'm going to use Galton's archetypes here, from a prostitute into a virgin, from a bad woman into a queen. So that change gives the same person a multitude of voices. When the movie starts, you see a prostitute speaking with the language of the high street, rugged language and so on, but eventually she turns into an educated virgin or a saint and so on. That story is actually a real story. That is what we find in real life situations. None of us are born as heroes. We always, well, very rarely we become heroes, but every single person can say, I'm the hero of my own house. In anyhow, the Bildungsroman is dialogic because the voice of a person changes its tonation by time. And Bakhtin also adds extra dimensions into dialogism in these. In the poetry, usually, the kind of language that the author uses never moves away from the high-class literary language. So he uses the best language possible and so on. Particularly in Middle Age poetry, there were so many rules of rhyme and so on. So the poetry was always ultimately literary language poetry. Nobody made poetry with the language of the streets, for example. Nobody made poetry with the language of the bazaar, the marketplace. Because in the marketplace, people do not speak perfect languages. They use broken sentences and so on. And Bakhtin says, but the real life is in the bazaar. It is in the marketplace, where people speak with several languages. Think of a situation where a seller in the bazaar who had no proper education is selling aubergine and something else, and somebody who is a judge in the Supreme Court of India came to the bazaar and he wants to buy something. Okay, think of the differences of languages. Of course, the judge from the Supreme Court knows that that is not the place to speak with the language of the highly educated lawyer. So he's not going to use Latin words and so on in order to ask, well, how much a kilo of aubergine costs. But he's going to get closer to the marketplace language or daily language, which we call parole in linguistics, not langue, but parole. But he will most probably find different voices and so on. When he comes out of the marketplace, he will say, "Oh, what an ugly use of language I have heard out there." But that is the real richness of life. It doesn't necessarily, dialogism does not necessarily put a dichotomy between the uneducated and the most educated, but also in different departments of a university, for example, the language changes. When you go to a medical faculty, the people speak with a particular language, but when you move into a philosophy department, the people start using a different language. So if you are at a technical department, the language is a technical language, and most probably if it is a English language department, people will start speaking another language. So if a literary representation, be it a novel or a poetry or a theater text and so on, if a text incorporates several different languages, if a text incorporates, poetry, letters, diaries, small scribbles, newspaper language, and so on, that is real life. In real life, we do not read and speak and live only on a poetical language. In real life, we do not communicate to our wives and children as if we are writing a letter. In real life, we do not content with only a particular language. We actually surf between different languages, sometimes technical, sometimes overtly philosophical, sometimes it goes down to the street level and so on. That multitude of languages, none of them being silenced and dominated by others, is the real life. And that is what Bakhtin calls dialogism. And he is inviting people to be open to dialogism in all of their communications. I'm going to turn back to dialogism after I introduce some more new concepts that is going to actually increase our understanding of dialogism. I am not doing this because I cannot do that now, because actually Bakhtin is teaching us how to do things like that. Bakhtin is saying, don't try to consummate or finish a particular topic at the beginning of your speech, because with the kind of information that you provide in the later stages, you have to turn back to the beginning of the speech, because the audience is going to better understand the original concept. We will understand, hopefully, when I come to later stages. I'm not sure whether you are able to see this picture. This is a word art. Everything is letters here. The chair is written, the chair is made of chair words, and the table is made of table. This picture tells me the core idea of context, a text carrying its context with it. This is very critical, and this is a revolutionary idea of text and context in Bakhtin. Many people in Western literary criticism has dealt with the problem of the context and text. And you might have heard on several occasions about literary criticism, whether it is a criticism of a Veda text or Pashinat or of Quran and so on. You might have heard the term, taken out of its context. So a text that is taken out of its context usually means nothing, or it means what the original author didn't want to mean. So, for example, there are several verses in the Quran that are taken out of their context, and they seem to be inviting violence and so on. Now, the point is, Bakhtin says it's impossible to take a text out of its context. But in Bakhtin's understanding, a text is never a sentence. A sentence, yes, a sentence can be taken out of its context, but a text is never a sentence. Text is always an utterance. Bakhtin makes a difference between a sentence and an utterance. A sentence is any single meaning carrying word, like yes is a sentence. Okay, yes, I have been listening to Dr. Kerim Balci is another sentence. Okay, these are sentences. But Bakhtin says utterance includes the context. So yes is an utterance if it also carries the whole event where that word was uttered, that yes was uttered. Okay? Think of it, a situation where somebody bought a lottery ticket and he is checking if he wins or not, and somebody is saying the numbers of winning ticket, and he is just with all kind of anxiety, he's listening to it, and in the end all 6 numbers fit to the numbers of the winning ticket, and he said yes. Okay, and Bakhtin says this yes is the utterance, and yet it includes in itself, that utterance includes in itself the whole story of buying a ticket, listening to the radio about the winning ticket number, and winning the lottery. And suddenly that yes carries the context in it. And Bakhtin says, in the situations of, in real life situations, we never speak with sentences. We always speak in utterances. So, for example, I am telling you a story. I'm trying to teach something about Bakhtin to you, but the very sentences that I use already have the context in it. You know, this context has this. You know, an organization in India had opened a dialogue course. About 30 students registered to the course. They are coming from this and that background. Behzad knows this academician and journalist from United Kingdom. He arranged that person to give a lecture. It is 11 o'clock in London, and it must be something like 4 o'clock in India. The time difference altogether and so on. The communication is taking place on Zoom, so the speaker is not able to see all the audience at once. He can see only 5 people at once, so he doesn't know whether the rest is listening or not, and so on. So this is all in every sentence that I am saying. And the fact that it is almost impossible to look at the camera directly, we usually look at the faces of the people who are watching us, makes the utterance also a strange utterance, but this is the utterance. So when you remember what I said, like for example, the term, every text carries the context in it. A text without a context is never a text. When you remember this sentence in the future, you will remember it together with the context. You will remember it as an utterance. My name, my voice will become a signature under that text. Occasionally we hear a sentence that is, you know, life-changing, that is so much mind-blowing and so on. And we record it to our minds. And we record it to our minds usually with the precise context that we heard this, with the person who said it. Even if we don't know the name, we don't remember the name, we remember the context. Now, this is utterance. The real life communication takes place in utterances. We don't communicate in sentences. Sentences are text without context. Well, that differentiation changes radically the whole idea of any textual commentary. The hermeneuticians of late 19th century, names like Kierkegaard, Dilthey, and so on, Dilthey is being the major revolutionary legal hermeneutician, or Emilio Betti, another legal historian, and so on. These people dealt with the idea of having a text in front of us without a context. As if we do find, say, the Quran in a cave without any history attributed or attached to it. It doesn't happen like that. If you are a Hindu, when you read Vedantic text, you do not read the Vedas as if you have found them in an isolated cave with no history, with no experience, with no human lives attached to them. They are attached to them. You know, 4,000 years of history is attached to Upanishads. Or 2,000 years of history is attached to the New Testament. And of course, all kinds of oral traditions also come down to us together with the text. That is the context of the text. And Bakhtin says, in fact, we never comment on single sentences that do not carry any context. We always comment on them with the context. If we do not know the context of the text, we usually ask for the context. So for example, he gives this beautiful example. Two men are sitting on the sofa and they are looking at the window. And one of them says, ah. The other one says, ah. And that is the whole communication. Okay? that and does not mean anything cut out of the context. But if we knew that those two people decided in the morning to go to the market, city center, and to make shopping, but they said, if it snows, we are not going to go. And they said, hopefully it's not going to snow. They are looking out of the window and it is heavily snowing. And the one said, and the other said, this communication becomes a real communication. That is an utterance. And it says, unfortunately, it is snowing. So as we decided we are not going to go to the city center, we have to stay idle and bored in the house. That whole meaning in it. And that meaning is actually in the context side of the communication. It is not the sentences. The does not mean that, but it means in this particular context. And that context is carried with the text, Bakhtin says. We communicate with utterances. We never communicate with sentences. Occasionally, in interfaith dialogue activities, people, I'm jumping to a practical situation. People do forget that they need to give context, and they start speaking in sentences. Like, for example, if you are a Muslim trying to communicate to a Hindu friend, you, as a Muslim, you of course have been enriched with the Islamic tradition you are born into. For the last 25 years, you are living in a Muslim family. You have been bombarded all kinds of data, information about the background of the Islamic tradition and so on. So when you say, for example, prophet, that word carries all kinds of connotations in your own religious tradition, okay? And say you are speaking to a Christian or a Jew. In Judeo-Christian tradition, the prophet is usually a madman. And a prophet is nothing like the prophet of Islam, where the prophets never do the wrong and so on. Go to the Bible, you will find all kinds of prophets who are autocrats, who do make idolatry, who fight the God, and so on. And that their understanding of prophet is completely different. But we use the same word for that. And if you forget if you do not communicate in utterances, if you only communicate with sentences, if you forget the context, that you are from a different context, actually, you have to open your own context to the other side in order to better communicate. Now, from this idea of opening your own context, opening yourself to the other in order to create a meaningful communication, I'm going to move to another concept, intertextuality. The term intertextuality is used in several different traditions, particularly in biblical studies. You will find intertextuality as a methodology of reading holy texts of different religious traditions. So, for example, if a Jew and a Christian and a Muslim come together and they read the story of Jonah, or they read the story of Joseph. Of course, the story of Joseph exists in all these three traditions. Or if you want to have an intertextual reading with Hindu traditions, where you will find similar modes of, intrafamily jealousies and so on, creating all kinds of problems, you will find certainly similar texts. And when you read those texts comparing to each other, it is called intertextual reading. And intertextuality is used as a mind-opening strategy while reading religious texts of one tradition. Interfaith dialogue activities usually involve on certain occasions, intertextual readings. But here, intertextuality means something else. In its core, Bakhtin says, no text is isolated from the human history. Every text has the overall major context of human history. So whenever you read a book, for example, whichever book you are reading, say you are reading the Sapiens of Yuval Harari, when you read that book, you cannot read that book in total isolation from your own history or total isolation from the history of humanity. There is no such hypothetical situation, say aliens are coming from a remote star. They have no idea of the human civilization. They have no idea of the history of human existence in this world. They have no idea of the language that we speak. So they pass by the world and they find a book, Sapiens, and they decipher language and they are reading it without any knowledge of previous human communication. We don't read books like that. That would be a textual reading with no intertextuality. But when we read, in fact, we already have accumulation of lots of texts in our minds. So, for example, as I'm a Muslim, I have read the Quran first, but later on I read the Bible. When I read the Bible, I had already certain knowledge of the biblical stories because of the similarities that we have in the Muslim tradition. In fact, I was shocked to find that some of the stories are so much so similar. That is intertextuality at its core. But Bakhtin forces intertextuality to the very thing that I said in the beginning. The universe is a text. The life is a text. Maria Ahmed is a text. Ziaul Haq is a text. So when I speak to Maria, the text that is Kerim Balci and the text that is Maria Ahmed are communicating. The two texts, as you see in this picture, two texts are actually entering into a dialogue. And that is precisely the utmost level of intertextuality when Bakhtin speaks about intertextuality. You may find lower levels of intertextuality in Bakhtin's books also. For example, if an author refers to an earlier text or to an earlier utterance that is used by somebody else, that is a way of intertextuality. Say, for example, I am speaking to you, but at some point I quote Abraham Lincoln saying this and that. When I quote Abraham Lincoln saying this and that, whatever I quote, if that quotation is also meaningful for you, if you also know that that quotation belongs to Abraham Lincoln, and if you also know who is Abraham Lincoln and what he has done in the history, what is his significance for the American constitutional tradition and so on, when I refer or quote Abraham Lincoln, I do not quote only one sentence. I quote the whole utterance of Abraham Lincoln. When, for example, the imams, the preachers in a Muslim mosque on a Friday, when they are speaking about a religious deity, when they quote the Quran, they know that that quotation includes in it the God in his totality. The Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, peace be upon him, in his totality, his life story in his totality, the Muslim generation in its totality. With one sentence, you actually invite, of course, to the level of the knowledge of the audience. Occasionally, you will find in the audience a knowledgeable man who knows better than you. I'm sure there are professors in front of me who knows better than me on philological or philosophical issues. So when I say something, they most probably remember or invite connotations from various different traditions. There might be among you people are saying, wow, I have never read Bakhtin, but I have seen similar things in this and that text. This is strangely reminiscent of Barth, for example, or Marx. So that connotation is invited by an utterance that I put in my speech or in my text. That is intertextuality. So Bakhtin, overall, he says, when you read a book, you actually read the whole human history, because you cannot use a word that didn't exist before you. Only, he says, for once in human history, one man, Adam, used a word that was never uttered before him. It will never happen again. Whenever you utter a word, and you may actually create nonsense, gibberish sentences, but not utterances. You cannot create a gibberish utterance. An utterance is a text with a context. And we communicate not in sentences. When you make up gibberish, made up words, you cannot create an utterance. It is not a communication. It is just meaningless sounds. Any meaningful sound which has an utterance, has a context, because they were uttered before you. And Bakhtin here says something utopian, actually, and he says the words never forget none of the occasions they were uttered. So when you use the word word, if the word was uttered quadrillion times in human history, it carries all meanings that it actually attained through those utterances. Of course, when we speak about a common word, so much so used like a word, you won't understand anything about it. But let us move to enlightenment, for example. This is a specific word. Whenever we say, oh, I'm enlightened, we not only refer to the idea of light, giving us light, enlightenment, but also whenever we say enlightenment, any learned man realize that we are referring to the overall human enlightenment that took place in 17th to 19th centuries in Western Hemisphere, because that is an era of enlightenment. Whenever we refer to a revolution, depending on the country that you are living, for example, if you live in China, whenever you use the term revolution, it has a major connotation of Maoist revolution. Or when you say it's like a long march, if you use this term in China, that is the long march of Maoists. But if you use this term in Utah, in the United States, that is the long march of the Mormons. So within its own context, the same word carries immense amount of information to you. Like, for example, many people from the Gülen movement or Hizmet movement of Turkey has been persecuted in Turkey, and they have left Turkey. And their exile is usually referred to hijra in Arabic, the exile. But they don't prefer using the term exile as it is in English. They prefer to use an Arabic word, hijra, because that term refers to the pilgrimage or to the exile of the Prophet of Islam when he was exiled from Mecca to Yazrib, soon to become his own city, Medina. And it suddenly takes on holy connotations. It actually becomes sacrosanct. It becomes sanctified. And suddenly, instead of becoming an unwanted exile, you become a muhajir, a person who leaves his country on the way towards a cause. And most of us use that strategy. You know, if you are a Hindu, you use the Hindu literature's instruments in order to refer to your day-to-day experiences and so on. And yet, when you do that, you actually connote to the depths of human history. Intertextuality is that we never happen to be in isolation from other texts. We never happen to be in isolation from other human beings. As a text, I, myself, is actually a part of a larger text, which is humanity. That actually brings me to another concept that we will find in Bakhtin. Polyphony, or with some nuances, heteroglossia. Bakhtin uses these two terms occasionally to mean the same thing and occasionally to mean two related things. When they are only related, polyphony is the ideal. Heteroglossia is the unescapable. Polyphony is, already when we were speaking about dialogue, we realized that human life is actually a multitude of voices. And when we were speaking about dialogue, we said Bakhtin believed a better novelist or a writer, author, is the one who gives maximum autonomy to the heroes to the level that they can actually revolt to the author. Well, if you take this into the human creation story, this is precisely what the Creator did to human beings. I'm speaking from a Judeo-Christian and Islamic perspective, so the Hindu or Jain friends forgive me here, but I'm sure you have similar issues of creation, a creator creating human beings in his image and so on. But in the Judeo-Christian and Islamic tradition, there is a God that creates the human beings, well, everything. In his image, he has created human beings, and actually in the human beings, he gave the will, which is free to such a level that we are able to reject the will of God. We are able to revolt to the will of God. We are not legally able, but we are practically able to declare ourselves even gods. Pharaoh and many other political leaders in the history of humanity actually declared themselves as gods. That is the level of freedom the original author of human history and human existence, God, has given to the heroes in this world, human beings. So Bakhtin says this is precisely what a good author has to do. If God, the real creator or real writer of the book of universe, has given such a level of autonomy to the heroes of the book, human beings, then it is the best practice. The best practice of authorship, writing, is to give autonomy to the heroes to the level that the heroes can run out of the book. The heroes can actually revolt to the overall plan of the author. You might have started writing your novel with the idea that you are going to have a hero who is going to move from the point A and reach to point B. But you have to leave the hero on his or her own when you start writing, so that the hero might be able to resist to the original plan. And in the end, you might find yourself in a situation that you cannot recognize your own hero. And in fact, in the Quran, we find such a verse. The God Almighty, Allah in Arabic, says, we have created this man out of a sperm and an egg. And look at him, look at him. He became something that I cannot recognize. He is revolting. That is precisely a real life situation. Well, in such a situation, no voice is suspended. No voice is silenced. No voice is oppressed. So the real life situation is a polyphonic situation where we hear lots of voices. Now, polyphony is realized when you start speaking with multiple voices. In the example I gave, the Supreme Court judge going to the marketplace in the bazaar, starting to speak with the, semi-broken language of the bazaar place, despite the fact that he doesn't feel himself belonging to that atmosphere. But while turning back to his own department, speaking with the language of the highly stylistic language of the legal communication, when he is speaking with the highly stylistic language of the communication, he is referring to the judges of the previous era and so on. Sometimes he is quoting them and so on. The previous decisions of the Supreme Court are usually quoted several times, and that is actually a polyphonic communication, multiplicitude of voices. When he moves to heteroglossia, Bakhtin says, in fact, it is inescapable. The real life conditions is multi-voiced. When somebody speaks to us, they actually speak to us with several voices. Bakhtin speaks about a utopian, general, universal dialogue atmosphere. And he says, time will come. Human beings will be able to listen to all the voices that intonates behind the utterances that we utter. So, for example, when I say, I love you, that utterance has been uttered billions of times up until now, some of them sincere, some of them, of course, you all know love has billions of different shades. And Bakhtin says, time will come, we will be able to hear all the utterances that were uttered in the same way. So if somebody says, I love you, we will hear the voices of the historical laws, Farhad Shirin, and so on. Those voices will come to our minds also. That is a utopian understanding, of course, but in the end, it refers to the heteroglossia of human condition. He says, when we are speaking to each other, actually our traditions are speaking. When Kerim Balci is speaking, it's not only Kerim Balci. It is, 1.5 millennia of Islamic tradition. It is 4 millennia of philosophical tradition. It is 400 years of communications tradition that is speaking. To whatever tradition he belongs to or the speaker belongs to, he is actually bringing to us all those voices from the background. He gives a beautiful example, and I am going to finish this part with that, and I have only 2 more slides. He says, once an author, a learned author, was asked how many years it took to finish this book. He had written a beautiful book, and he was asked how much time he spent writing the book. And he said, well, we have been trying to write this throughout the human history, starting from Adam and Eve. Because the words that I use does not belong to me. Those words were created before me. The concepts that I used were already given to me. The tradition, the language that I used was already there. And it was created in 4,000 or 5,000 years of human existence. So he says every book, in fact, every communication is a continuation of a previous communication. We are not in limbo. We are not in isolated situation. That, of course, puts us in a position that, sometimes interfaith, intercultural dialogue activists happen to think that they are the people who do dialogue and other people do not do dialogue. No, says Bakhtin. Heteroglossia is inescapable. The human existence is in dialogue. We are in continuous dialogue with our previous traditions. Even the most monologic communication is a part of a dialogic human existence. Now, in such a condition, Bakhtin brings in front of us another amazing concept, unfinalizability. Of course, he was writing in Russian, so some translators translated it into English as unfinalizability. Some others translated as open-endedness. The idea of unfinalizability has all kinds of connotations in different traditions. If you are a commentator of a holy text or of any text, Bakhtin would say the meaning is unfinalizable. Meaning, we read a book, say the Quran or Upanishads, we understand something. The next time we read the same text, we understand something extra, something else. The meaning, Bakhtin says, is unfinalizable. The meaning is an event that is open-ended. It always evolves. Bakhtin says any text that is created by an author is dispatched from the author and starts its own career. And even after the author passes away, the career of the text continues on. Of course, the holy books is a best example about that. But he says also, our personal parole communications, day-to-day communications also are unfinalizable. So, for example, we will finish this course, and some of you will say, well, we have listened things that sound interesting, but we understood nothing. And some of you will say, well, we understood something, but we didn't understand why we were taught those concepts. What will I do with unfinalizability in an interfaith or intercultural dialogue activity? How will it help me? That is precisely what is unfinalizability. You will add on new meanings on it. You will add your own history. You will add your own context to the utterance that I actually happen to have uttered. And it is going to be enriched. That unfinalizability, when you read it about the text that is also a human being, like Ziaul Haq is an utterance, Ziaul Haq is a text, but he is never a finalizable text. He is never ended. He's always an open-ended text. I put these pictures with unfinished faces in front of them because Bakhtin says Every human being is an event that is becoming, not being, not being, that is becoming. Because of that, Bakhtin was totally against the idea of writing an autobiography. He says, unless you die, your event is not ended. It's not finalized. You didn't say your last word yet. This is a beautiful tradition in Muslim tradition also. You might find a person quite good, but not Muslim, but he's still alive. Okay, he is unfinalizable. He can, at the last minute, become a Muslim, if you are a Muslim, of course, become a Muslim and suddenly be somebody else. So every human being is an open event, because every human being is a text. And just like the multiple readings of a text, the more we read a text, the more we understand. I'm not saying the better we understand, but certainly the more we understand. We put in extra meanings to the text. The same is true for a human being. Many people get married with each other, thinking that they know each other enough. But after 20 years of marriage, they suddenly realize that their partner has become somebody other than they thought they were. Of course, in classical in-house struggles, this is usually they complain that you have changed. No, this is not the person I loved. You have changed. No, this is human being. This is the reality of human beings. We are open-ended events that is always in a process of becoming. Only when we die, we seal our story. We become. And then somebody else can write our life story. Of course, in many situations, those people who are writing our biographies will not be able to reach the totality of information, data that explains who we are. So you may find every other 10 years a new biography of a famous person coming out that depicts a different person in front of us. In fact, Bakhtin himself suffered from this. Well, whether suffered or benefited, most probably benefited from this, because in 1980s his biographies were all about what a Marxist person he was. In 2000s, he became suddenly an Orthodox Christian. In 2020s, he became a postmodern prophet who actually outpaced his era 100 years. So by time, even the dead people continue to become. What does this say? In practical dialogical communications these days, the human being in front of you is never going to be the same after this communication. In fact, throughout any intertextual, I'm referring to a previous term, any intertextual communication, like for example, Muhammad Baligh is not going to be the same Muhammad Baligh after this lecture. Okay, he might have become a more bored Muhammad Baligh because he didn't like the lecture. Okay, he might have become an enlightened Baligh. He might have become a person who have decided that he will never read Bakhtin at all. Okay, but in anyhow, he won't be the same Muhammad. The text, through the intertextual communication with my text, will become another text. This, of course, brings us to Martin Buber, a Jewish theologian and literary critic of, again, early 20th century. Buber is famous of his I and thou. And Buber said, when I and you speaks, no I and you remains. We all become dull. This reminds us, Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi, the Sufi poet of 14th century Anatolia, Turkey, who is actually from Afghanistan originally, when Afghanistan didn't exist. This was the Ilkhanate era. And he said, leave aside I and you. There is a river that is going in front of us. River meaning, of course, in Sufi terminology, life. There is a river in front of us. Let us enter and have a shower in that river. And in that river, there won't be any longer I or you. It will become all we. Any communication, any human life interaction makes us. So human event is a continual becoming. Don't judge people. Don't be judgmental, because human beings are unfinalized events. Usually human beings are more merciful, compassionate about unfinalizability of children. When, for example, we find a child at the age of 4 or 5 do something nasty, we don't say, this is going to be a nasty man. Right? We say, well, he's going to grow up, he's just a child. Well, Bakhtin says, all of us grow. We all continue on becoming something. Then we move to the dialogic self. And this is somewhere that is very crucial and very relevant to practical dialogue. Because every human being is a text, because every interaction between human beings is an intertextual interaction between texts, because every human being is yet to become something else, because human existence is an open-ended, unfinalizable event. The self is never a closed event. The self, when I say I, it's not in me. The self is always a product of an intertextual interaction. I become somebody else through each and every instance of interacting with others. And that interaction is a collaborative interaction. Even with the worst man, even with the worst uncommunicating person, which doesn't respond to my questions, which hates me. Say I'm a Muslim and I am trying to communicate to an anti-Islamist who hates all Muslims, who believes all Muslims are terrorists and have to be, killed and annihilated and so on. Even in such a least level of interaction, my open-ended event of being evolves into something else. Not necessarily towards good. Maybe in such a communication, after the end of such an interaction, I might become less than who I was. But I will certainly change. There is no possibility that you will enter into an intertextual communication relation with others, and yet you will come out as the same. Change is inevitable. One, self is an interim phenomenon. What does this mean? Self is not in you. Self is a social thing. Self is something that is created through your interaction with others by the constructive stones or bridges you actually take as loan from others. When you are speaking about yourself, don't forget that it is created by constituent elements that are taken from other people. First of all, you take something from your mother. from your father, and so on. Of course, genetically, you already took something from them. But over that, also by way of experience, the initial years of, majority of your communication being with your mother and father, if you are happily, luckily in a family where you grew up under the auspices of your parents, you take things from them and you build up yourself. That self is created in a dialogic way. Of course, you might say, well, this is different. This is quite different from Hegelian understanding of dialectics. The Hegelian understanding of dialectics was that human self is in constant dialectic struggle with his environment, and we do create ourselves in opposition to others, not in taking loans from others. Dialectically, not dialogically. That is the revolutionary idea that underlines all the writings and concepts of Bakhtin. And that is why I brought Bakhtin in front of you instead of Hegel, for example. Hegel most probably would say, no, human beings are in themselves, and in fact, we do create ourselves in ourselves in order to make ourselves as distinctive as possible from others. We look at the face of Maria Ahmed and I say, okay, I'm not Maria. Okay, she is such and such, and I am not such and such. Okay, and Muhammad Ali is such and such, and I am not such and such. And I do create my own self is indistinctive in otherifying the others, in putting distance between us. And Bakhtin says, no, it's not like that. Even when you speak with or about the most hated person, even if you speak about Satan, you take something from Satan and use it as your constituent element. And it becomes your satanistic poem. If you speak with saints, you take something from the saints, it becomes your saintly poem. You take continuously elements from others. That is precisely a principle in any kind of intercultural, interfaith, interreligious, interontological, if you wish. Certainly you can enter into a dialogue with your cat or with even a tree in the park. So dialogue does not end between human beings. They are texts also, and we are texts. So certainly you can speak to an apple tree in the park. And that communication will certainly change you. There is no way, there's no possibility or of an ideal, well, it's not ideology actually, but of an idealized situation that you will enter into a dialogue and you will change the other side, but you won't change. That would be preaching. That would be proselytizing. That would be a monologic communication. And many people who believe that they do enter into monologic communications, they do not realize that in this heteroglossia of multi-voicedness in this universe, there is no escape from dialogue. You either make it creatively, engagingly, or you become victim of it. Many Christian missionaries, for example, moved into other countries with the hope of converting other people. They managed sometimes, but occasionally they themselves were converted. Of course, when they were sent, they believed that they were in a holy crusade of converting other people. They will turn back without changing even a bit, but it doesn't work like that. So if you're a Muslim and you speak about interfaith dialogue and you put barriers, you guard yourself and you say, I'm entering into this dialogue with these Sikh and Jain and Hindu and Buddhist people, and yet I'm not going to change. You are fooling yourself. You will change, because yourself is going to be a bit Hindu, a bit Sikh, a bit Jain, a bit Buddhist. And only through a creative engagement and openness to change, you can actually change other people also. Bakhtin calls people who think they do not change as pretenders. They pretend that they do not change, but they do change actually. Let me finish with towards a new paradigm in human sciences. Bakhtin started to write this in 1971. This was the last attempt of Bakhtin to write an anti-Hegelian book. But of course, Bakhtinian understanding would never use the term anti-Hegelian, because that would be a Hegelian term, because that would be dialectic. Bakhtin never said, I am anti-Hegelian. In fact, he said, I took this from Hegel, and I'm now changing it to something else. Bakhtin promoted in his notes from 1971. Unfortunately, that book never became into a full-fledged book. They were just scribblings of notes that came to his mind. He never managed to live long enough to write that book, but maybe that is the good thing about that book, because that book became an open-ended event that lets us more space to comment and, of course, add our own views into it. And yet, Bakhtin was clear that he was trying to create a new methodology of human sciences, or, if you wish, humanities. And this methodology would not be a dialectic methodology, where in Hegelian dialectics, as you know, there is a thesis, and then by time that thesis becomes so dominant and so oppressive that the oppressed classes or people or persons start to create an anti-thesis. And despite the fact that the thesis is in a power position, and that power relationship puts the thesis in an advantaged place, there is no way no thesis will not be influenced by the antithesis. By time, the thesis and antithesis is going to create a synthesis. And that synthesis is going to become the thesis of the next loop. And as in the pyramid you are seeing in the dialectic card here, those, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and then synthesis becoming thesis, and then antithesis emerging, and then new synthesis, we are going to move towards the best possible thesis, Hegelian understanding said. And in the end, Hegel believed that we would reach to a situation of Geist, the spirit, where we would never need to create another antithesis, because the ultimate synthesis would become reached. Bakhtin says we are already in the Geist. The Geist is heteroglossia. The Geist is not one synthesis that overarches and covers the whole world. The Geist is the multitude of voices. We are already in the Geist, and we are in a dialogic interaction between thesis and the other thesis. It is not an antithesis now, an alternative thesis, and they create synthesis, but synthesis is not something other than the two theses. Both theses become synthesis. Okay. Put there human beings, it is, Behzat and Kerim, they are speaking to each other on an issue that they didn't previously agree on. In the end, they still do not agree, but both of them has changed what their original positions were. One of them continued to be strictly believing in his own position, in fact, even more so than the previously. The other one changed a bit of his ideas and so on. The dialogic communication or dialogic interaction between thesis and another thesis, beware that I'm not going to say anti-thesis, and then creating several new intonations, instantiations of theses, is an alternative human sciences paradigm that we are yet to create. So we do believe in dialogue activities, that it is not only about peace building between Muslim and Hindu, Muslim and Jain, Muslim and Sikh, Hindu and Sikh, Buddhist and atheist, and so on. It's not just about peace building. It is about building the new human being, the new self, the new I, that is going to feel that he is or she is indebted to the others because of his existence. I am who I am only because thanks to who you are, not because against who you are. Thanks to who you are. That inclusivity is going to move, hopefully, into sciences also. Many of us in dialogic activities, our dialogical imagination brings the maximum thesis-antithesis clash of Hegelian world into a dialogic relationship, science and religion. The Hegelian world believed that the ultimate dialectics is between science and religion, and the synthesis would become the triumph of science. And we believe, no, it's not going to be a triumph. The triumph is already there. It is the common existence of multi-voiced, polyphonic, heteroglossic existence of religions altogether, and non-religiosity, atheism, with them also, and science with them, and several different versions of paradigms of science. In the Quran, there is a particular verse that the dialogue activity engages love. They refer to it as the verse of dialogue. It says, if God wanted, he would have created all of you into one religious group. You would all be made into Muslims or Hindus or Buddhists if he wanted so. No, he wants you to be different, so that you will come to each other. And in Arabic it says, لِتَعَارَفُوا. You will increase your enlightenment. You will enlighten each other. It doesn't say you will be enlightened by others. It says mutual enlightenment. لِتَعَارَفُوا is mutual enlightenment. Come together for mutual enlightenment. In fact, come together to build yourselves. I think this is already over an hour, and it's a good time for me to stop. I promise if you have any questions, I am going to try to be more dialogic in my answers, and I'm going to try to be more practical also, not at this level of philosophical discussion. But I assure you, if you continue on writing and reading on Bakhtin and his dialogical imagination, your dialogical lives will become better. If you are married, your relations with your wife or husband will become dialogic. Most of the time, we engage into dialectic relationships with our wives and husbands, and it doesn't work. A synthesis is never wanted in a family. Well, we want different theses. So dialogic imagination, despite the fact that it started from literary criticism and moved into some kind of philosophical thinking, it has practical applications. And if you read a bit more about Bakhtin, you will find certainly a lot of applications in your different areas of studies. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kerim Balci, for this very enlightening presentation. We have at least 4 people right now want to ask questions. First, Vishal Prasad. Vishal.
Hello, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, indeed.
Yes, you are. Go ahead.
Direct greetings, Dr. Balci. I'm Vishal. So I will shoot away my question straight away. So my question is, what characterizes monologism? You said in your lecture that one is the authoritative tone of the author. What apart from that?
Do I have to answer now, or I can take 4 questions and then maybe answers will be relating to each other?
Okay, sure. So Nitya Prakash.
Yes. Hello,
Yes,
sir.
Nitya.
And thank you so much for this profound and life-affirming perspective on dialogue. I'm a student of psychoanalysis coming from a literary criticism. So, I have always operated in the mode of a dialectic, where even language is so much fragmented and we end up repressing so much. And in fact, the large view that we take is that how a lot of things are beyond representation when it comes to even through language. And that is how I thought Bakhtin is going so much beyond the structural paradigm and trying to create this space where we can identify more with others rather than differentiate. So, sir, my question is that, when we talk about, when we understand ourselves as a text, then how is it, how are we placing the language here? Is it more about the written form of language, or because the dynamics changes in an intersubjective space? I mean, that's how I understand that, our voices might be more concealed, or what Laka says, that our language perhaps conceals more that it reveals. So there is too much of complexity. So, and another question, sir, I have that what kind of literary forms of writings you find to be extremely dialogic, as in like novels, or, so is there a literary form which primarily operates on a dialogic principle? So that is one question, and thank you so much. Yes.
Thank you, Nitya. You
Nitya.
actually summarized most of my presentation. Thank you. In much better terms than I did. Yeah, I am listening to other questions.
Asharuddin.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Kerim, so thank you for your wonderful presentation. And my question is that, Bakin was a strong critic of poetry. And moreover, we know that many poetry or poetry have references to history, sociology, etc. Then how could we neglect the importance of poetry with respect to dialogue? That's my question. Thank you, sir.
And finally, Muhammad Baligh in this round.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Baligh.
So, thank you, Dr. Kerim, for your enlightening perspective on dialogue. So, I see you've referred to unfinalizability and open-endedness as part of a dialogue. So, I just want to know, how do you look at it from a perspective of informal and formal communication, sir? That's my question.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. As I promised, I am going to try to be a bit dialogic in my answers. so that it is going to also crystallize the distinction between a monologic communication and a dialogic communication. First of all, if I am sure about all my answers, if I say this is a monologic communication. I should always be open to the idea of convincibility. Now, Nitya should be able to come and convince me about a different perspective. So I should always, that openness actually puts me onto a shaky ground. Never again I will be sure about what I am saying. That doesn't mean you are going to lose faith to your own convictions. That means you are always going to keep tight, because you know you are shakeable, and you have to be open to listening. If you believe that you know the ultimate truth, say about what Bakhtin said, you will be close to any input. The overall idea of dialogism is to be open to input, not as an information entering into you, but as a constituent block, a bridge constituent block that will change you. So when Nitya says something, it does not add to my knowledge. It does, but not only adding to my knowledge. It makes me what I am. It adds to me. So every communication is an attempt to become. The term becoming is very important there. Let us not forget about that. Now, the first question was about, what kind of communications are monological. I gave the example of the lyric poetry. Not necessarily any poetry, but the lyric poetry. Lyric poetry is the poetry where, it is usually the ancestry poetry or the poetry of the antiquity about wars of the Greeks and the Romans and so on, and most of the religious texts, because they come from a position of authority. God says, do this, this is the truth, and do this. Okay? There's no discussion. You cannot open that to discussion because of that authority. But thanks to many religious traditions, when we look deep into the religious text, we realize that God is actually a dialogic author. It actually leaves us a lot of space to fill in the blanks. It is true that there are monological parts in it. In every religious text, there are dialogical silences. That is referring to the second question of Nitya also. I will come to that. The missing texts. The holy text is not what is in the text. The holy text is largely what is not in the text, what is missing, what is not written, what is left to us to fill, to engage with the text. In fact, the term textuality passed through a metamorphosis in the second half of the 20th century. In the first half of the 20th century, when the linguists or literary critics used the term textuality, they were referring to a completeness of a text. In the second half of the 20th century, textuality started to mean the openness of a text to any kind of intertextual interaction with the readers. Of course, together with the second half of the 20th, particularly after 1980s, we see emergence of readers' response theoreticians to their extremes like Fish and so on, where they have no respect to the author or to the text even. They say everything is in the mind of the reader. I'm not in that extreme, but certainly the reader is a party to the creation of meaning that continues on. The reader makes a text into an open-ended event. Now, any kind of communication that does not let the reader to engage, to add something, is a monologic communication. So a lyric poetry does not let you add something to it because it is finished, it is completed, it is perfect. You know? And it sometimes is so powerful that when you read it, you feel yourself, you know, oppressed in front of the words. If the words are so powerful, so perfect, so rhythmic, so overarching, you know, surpassing your capacity, you are nobody there. A beautiful example of a monologue can be a monologue between a highly sophisticated language using doctor who is referring to Latin terms and so on while speaking to an 8-year-old child about an illness. Okay? So most probably the child will look and think, what language is this person speaking? I got a few words, but that's all, you know? After that conversation, it's not a conversation actually. After that conversation, if you said to the child, okay, you continue the conversation, you would most probably take only silence. You would say, I understood nothing. How can I continue the communication? Okay? That is a monologic communication par excellence. Of course, it's a hypothetical situation. It never happens. Well, sometimes it happens. Sometimes my wife is a computer engineer, and sometimes she does not understand a question about an algorithm, and she asks my help. And I have studied physics and so on. I'm quite into algorithmic thinking, so I think I can. Well, okay, let me help you. I read the question, I get nothing about it. You know, I don't understand at all, because that is their language. That is their specific language. That language, they do understand each other. When that is a conversation between two computer engineers, it is a communication. But when it is done with me, it is no longer a communication. It is a monologism. This is, of course, an extreme case. But in poetry, lyric poetry, I'm underlining, not all poetry. In lyric poetry, particularly in, I'm not knowledgeable about Urdu or other language poetry, but in Arabic and in Persian poetry, the rhyme is so much so into every suffixes, prefixes of the words. It's not only the end of the word, it is the numbers of the numerical values of letters even are counted in Arabic poetry. The algebraic numerical values are counted. So you cannot even take one letter out of the text because it is so much so perfected that you cannot change a sentence. You cannot change a word in this. That is a closed event. That's finished. You cannot add anything. But of course, many poetical traditions created alternatives, areas, zones of dialogic engagement. For example, in Turkish tradition, there is a culture of writing responses to the poetry, poems. So say a poem is about the 6th century Prophet Muhammad's wonderful attributes. You can take it and rewrite the poem with the same form and use some of the plots that are used in the original poem, but refer it to somebody else in another era. Okay? In Turkish, it is called nazire, and nazire means response. But that suddenly dialogizes, which was normally a monologic event. The original poem is still a monologic poem, but suddenly poetry becomes dialogical. In fact, in Eastern Turkey, there had been traditions of poetry nights where poets are coming together and they are, writing, well, speaking poetically to each other and following the rhythms and rhymes of the other one. So it is a kind of mutual competition of writing poem instantaneously. And that, of course, has a dialogic element into it. So poetry not necessarily always monologic, but in Bakhtinian understanding, poetical language is monologic language. Novelistic language is dialogic language. This doesn't mean every novel is dialogic. This doesn't mean every poetry is monologic. But he categorized the majority of the poetry is poetical and majority of the novels are dialogic. So he says novelistic language is dialogic language. Sermons of political leaders, usually populist political leaders, are monologic in nature. When a nationalistic leader comes out and gives a amazing speech that moves the audience, who is also a nationalist audience, and people love it and so on, but the flow of communication is from the speaker to the audience. He doesn't care what the audience think. He doesn't care what the audience respond and so on, because he knows, he has the ultimate perfection. He is just enlightening others. Okay? He's not going to learn anything from the people when he is listening to, who are listening to him. That is a monologic communication. Hitler was a perfect monologue. Okay? His monologism does not mean bad. He was an amazing speaker, but it was a monologic speech. And the idea, the problem with monologic speech is they usually create cults. If the speaker is particularly able in his monologic or her monologic speeches, the intertextuality becomes invasion of one text by other text. So the text of the preacher invades the selves of other people, and suddenly you start to see the followers as followers. They are not real human beings, they are not selves, they are just followers of the leader, they are just followers of the preacher, they are just the followers of the religious authority and so on. Many religious authorities prefer monologic communication. They're not open to discussion, they're not open to change themselves, they do not listen to the audience, they are cut off from real life situations. They preach an ideal in their mind, which does not need confirmation from other people, because who are the other people? They are poor, ignorant people that need to be enlightened. That is monologism. In modern era, I can refer you to people like Bolsonaro in Brazil, or nowadays in the leader of Belarus is an amazingly successful monologue. Okay, your situation is India is not too much different, but I don't know Urdu language, so I cannot comment on the level of monologic communication in politics. Traditionally, India has always been a polyphonic, heteroglossic. You speak thousands of different languages and so on, not only by means of different ethnical languages, but also different socioeconomical strata and so on. That was an amazing richness. I hope India is going to say, you know, to keep that richness there. Now, Nitya's questions are quite difficult, particularly whenever Lacan is quoted. Lacan is a huge man, giant in literary criticism. Whenever Lacan is quoted, you usually have to be, you know, humbled and say whatever he said. Lacan is an amazing monologue in philosophy, no, psychology of language, because he has done amazing studies, and usually the people who read Lacan simply accept whatever he says. And that is one reason why Bakhtinians do not like him. But it is true that Bakhtin went beyond structuralism, in fact, beyond post-structuralism. And it's one reason why Bakhtin is usually referred to, you know, even a postmodern thinker who came even before modernity, at the heydays of modernity. He dealt with some of the problems that was yet to be realized, like historicism, for example. Historicism was not a problem in 1925, but he already foresaw the problem and solved the problem. Unfortunately, what he has written had to wait 60 more years to be translated into any Western language. In those 60 years, Western hermeneuticians spent a lot of time and lost a lot of time with discussing historicism. Yet, Nitya suggested that it becomes an intersubjective area. Well, Bakhtin is totally intersubjective. You know, Bakhtin does not believe in objectivity. In fact, if both the reader and the read text are both texts, you cannot be objective. The classical utopia or fallacy of objectivity in social and human sciences is based on the idea that the knowing subject, meaning the scientist, is on a different ontological level with what he or she knows. So, for example, when you go to a laboratory and you study on the, you know, internal organs of a frog, frog is something that is studied. It's an object. It's not a subject. Ontologically speaking, you are, as the scientist, at a superior ontological level compared to the object of your scientific knowledge. That was the idea. And Bakhtin's idea, frog is a text, you are a text. Ontologically, you do not belong to any different level, not alone, let alone being superior to the frog. You are not superior, it's a text, and in fact, sometimes the text of the frog might be quite sophisticated, even mind-blowing compared to your simple text. You might find a small fish much sophisticated than your own self. Then if you belong to the same ontological level, that means any kind of interaction between the two, the frog and the man, cannot be an objective interaction. It means intersubjectivity. There are two subjects there. In fact, Bakhtin always fought against the idea of objectivity. He always did all his studies at the sphere of intersubjectivity. Well, the open-endedness of the self, openness to change as the self, the creation of the self as an interim being between myself and the others, these are all issues of intersubjectivity. In fact, the term intersubjectivity was created long after Bakhtin dealt with these issues. Yes, the question, Nitya's question also refers to what kind of a language then? When we say language, do we refer to what? Is it the lang that Saucer would see fit for any study? As you know, Saucer, the founding father of linguistics, didn't find parole, meaning day-to-day communication, as fit for study. The Bakhtinian revolution is, Bakhtin says, the parole is more worth study, because it is most of our lives do not pass in literary communications. We do just simply speak in daily languages, and that deserves a study, he says. One, that means the kind of language that we find ourselves as human beings as texts is a parole, day-to-day language, daily language. You know, I myself might have studied philosophy or literary critic or religious theology and so on, but I do not find myself as a text as a theological text, myself as a text as a philosophical text. Of course, I have bits from there, but I'm rather a father, a husband, a human being, you know, an overweight man, a bald man, and so on. You know, these are a majority of my text, my day-to-day reality. But of course, when we spoke about the utterance having the context in it, that context is not just the house. You know, my utterance is not this kitchen. You know, I'm speaking from the kitchen. This is not my context. My context is my history. And that is not only my history that started in 1970s. That is my history that started with Adam and Eve. Whatever history you believe with humankind, that is my context. And Bakhtin's understanding is that language carries all of it with it. That is that is the reason why Bakhtin's communication study is usually referred to either metalinguistics or a kind of spiritual linguistics. It's not just linguistics, it is metalinguistics that continuously engages and refers and connotes and codes the totality of human history and human traditions and human collectivities and so on. So that is Bakhtin himself says, my discipline is at the junction of several other disciplines: anthropology, sociology, psychology, you know, politics, at the junction of those sciences. So it is not linguistics, it's not philosophy, it is not anthropology on its own, it is something in between. That is actually fitting to the overall understanding of Bakhtin. The second question by Nitya said, what kind of literary forms I find more dialogic? I already answered that. Any literary form that spares space to engagement of audience or readers is the best dialogic form. Missing text is a major strategy. Okay? There have been new attempts in Hollywood movies sometimes in order to create dialogic interaction. For example, choices. In cartoon movies particularly, you watch the movie, at some point the scene comes, do you want the hero to go this way or that way, and you make the choice. And then you watch the movie according to your choice. That is a space that movie leaves to you. You go to an amazing movie that is well done and completed. It doesn't leave any space to you to think about, to comment about, and so on. You just enjoy it and come out. and you say, I feel as if I was in another world, you know, it was almost real. And then if somebody asks, what do you think? I said, what should I think? It's just a movie. I watched it. I loved it. That's it. That is a monologic movie. Okay? It has to leave space to you. It has to speak to your own life condition. It has to raise questions in your mind. Right? And when you come out of the movie, if you say, it's not his product, it's my product. Right? It's not the producer's or director's product only, it's also my product because I chose to do this and that. Okay? A novel that you read by jumping some of the pages might actually become a more creative reading of the novel, because you don't know what the original author wrote there, you fill in the gaps, and it becomes a beautiful game. If there are among you teachers of literature, try this. Just ask your students, just rip 10 pages from the book that they will never read, okay? Then comment about what might have been in those pages. When my daughter here in the United Kingdom started studying in the primary school, I was, of course, reading books in the evenings to her. And then one of the teachers told me, are you just reading? And I said, yeah, I'm reading. But that is not interactive reading, he said. What is interactive reading? I said. He said, open the page, don't read anything, show the pictures to your daughter and say, what do you think will happen in this page? Right? Then read the page. By the end of the page, don't open the next page, say, what do you think in the next page we will see? And always at the end of the page, say, what would happen if he didn't do that, if the hero didn't do that and did this? That is the way of having the audience, the reader, into the meaning production. And by that way, actually, you can read the same book 100 times. This time, you will add different elements into it. So I believe Bildungsroman, the Western, novels, starting from Goethe, but particularly Russian novels, because most of them, following the example of Gogol, are psychological novels. Inescapably, they are polyphonic. They have a lot of sounds that you hear. Occasionally, even the sounds come from beneath the earth, from the graveyards and so on. That is inescapably dialogic. This doesn't mean only dialogic novels are good. A monologic novel can become quite attractive and good also, but it leaves no space to your participation. Now, the critique of poetry, as Asharuddin said, I think I have already touched this issue. Bakhtin never criticizes poetry as per se. He criticizes a poetical language that he defines as monologic. And in fact, by the end of his book, the first book, and later on by the end of his PhD thesis, Rabelais' work, we find him referring to Pushkin's poetry. He is quoting from Pushkin occasionally. And he was asked why he was so critical of poetical language, and he still quoted poems of Pushkin. And he said, well, there is a difference between poetry and poetry. There are monologic poems, usually lyric poems, that does not let you add anything, okay? Where the whole story is finalized. The issue is this: when you engage into a dialogue between two people, two texts, okay? If one of those texts is completely sealed off, close to any kind of change, you will seal yourself off also. It won't become a communication. You know, say a Muslim and a Sikh are speaking, okay? And both sides believes that they have the ultimate truth, and both sides enter into the dialogue only by the intention of convincing and converting the other side. There's no conversation there. Okay? And you will soon realize the other side is not listening to you. No, he is asking you questions, but not listening to your answers. He's just asking you questions in order to bring the issue to a particular topic where he's going to convince you. That is a monologue. That's an attempted monologue. But Bakhtin certainly loves poetry. And in fact, many Bakhtinian scholars have studied later on poetry by Shakespeare, Francis Bacon, James Joyce particularly, Proust. These are all dialogical, you know, true and true, particularly James Joyce. James Joyce has written novels in poetical language, particularly Ulysses is such. If you didn't read, please do so. The last question, Mohammed, was, I have lost the question. Mohammed, can you repeat your question, please? Information.
Sir, the question was, you've spoken about open-endedness, right?
Yes.
How do you look at open-endedness and unfinalizability in context of formal and informal communication?
Beautiful. Yeah, well, formal and informal communication usually corresponds to langue and parole. In Saussurean categorization, Saussure said the formal communication is done by langue, where we abide by the grammatical rules of a language and so on, whereas parole is the street language, or the you know, the common man's speech in daily life, which Saussure believed does not deserve to be studied because it doesn't obey any rules and so on. So in Saussurean understanding, the formal communication deserved any kind of attention, because when we study a communication, it was not the communication itself, it was the rules of the communication that we studied. Whereas Bakhtin says, we are not studying the rules of the communication, we are not studying the communication itself also. We are studying the communication plus the context of the communication. That is the utterance. So that is the reason where Bakhtin says the informal communication deserves more study. The parole deserves more study. And when you read his books, you will find that is the reason why he loves novels, because novels usually make a mixture of formal and informal communication. In Dostoevsky, for example, you will find Dostoevsky was a journalist originally. So you will find a lot of newspaper clippings in the you know, always he reads some passage from a newspaper. Well, newspaper is a formal language about an informal event. Then letters. Letters are usually written in formal language, particularly if they are petitions in a Soviet atmosphere or Tsarist Russian atmosphere. They have to be in a formal language. But then, you know, swearing and fighting in the market, bazaar, and so on, particularly in the, you know, in the doorsteps of a house. Bakhtin loves the doorsteps, because doorsteps is actually the passageway between the public space and the private space, and it is always intriguing to be at the doorstep. And most of the horror movies are horror movies of doorsteps. Yeah, you know, a door is opened suddenly with a grudge sound and so on. You never know what will come out, because that is the place you have the surprise, and it makes the thing open-ended, you know. When just think of yourself watching a movie, okay, and the heroes of the movie enter into a dark hall, and they have torches in their hand, and the torch looks at the walls and so on. Together with the moving torch, you are always surprised and surprised. You see things and things, but then you find a doorway, okay? And yet, they don't enter into the doorway. Right? They go to somewhere else. That doorway is an open-ended event there. It is, you know, it's a hook for your mind. You will certainly, your mind is going to say, what was that? Why didn't they pass that? They will most probably come to that doorway because, you know, screenplay writers usually use those hooks in order to make intertextual comes and goes, you know. They show you something and they use it later on in the movie so that you turn back to that scene and remember that scene again. That is the Bakhtinian strategy of presentation. You give them something in the beginning, later on something else, so that they will always turn back to the original ideas, and it will grow, continuously grow. You know, sometimes we don't watch the last scene of a movie, and then we hear people commenting on the part that we watched, but they say a lot of things that we didn't realize. Okay, why? Because that in that last scene, suddenly the previous scenes changed the meaning. Suddenly, the hero became a villain. You didn't watch that last scene, so your hero is still a hero. This is precisely the open-endedness. So it certainly enters into the informal communication part of the issue, but Bakhtin is not close to formal communication. Well, the point is this: you go to a dialogue event. I'm sure you are going to organize many dialogue events within Dialogue Foundation, okay? And the speaker comes with a paper, a written speech, okay? And he or she reads the text, which is written pure formal language, okay? And it might be written very good academically speaking. It gives a lot of information, but it doesn't engage, okay? And it's not in your daily language, you know, you cannot use it. I am studying law, and our solicitors, particularly in the United Kingdom, they are so much into the formal language that I sometimes ask them, are you speaking with your children with this language, you know? This is not normal, man, you know? You cannot make jokes in legal English. Yeah. So just, you know, we are friends. When we are speaking, be yourself. Don't be the solicitors, okay? But by the time their language turn into that one, they never say, they never say, no, maybe this is wrong. I will say something else. Do that, because human beings make mistakes, hesitate, forget, you know. So when you say, I forgot the name of the guy, he said something like this, it's not weakness, it is humanness. Otherwise, it is totally formal communication. And at the end of a formal communication, what is left to you is to reread the text. Usually they do that, yeah? They make the presentation and then they distribute the text for those who want to read it again. Okay? Because it's formal communication. It says actually don't add anything into it. Just use it as I said. Okay? Whereas an informal communication is open to any kind of adding. But of course, everybody has to be understanding. You know, whenever I make an totally open-ended presentation, I advise my listeners, and I'm going to advise you today also, quote this event, but not me. Okay, Nitya, don't say Kerim Balci said this. I say I learned something from somebody, but it is my information now. I am saying this. It's yours because we did it together. It is an interim thing. You know, we created the meaning together. Bakhtin is there. Buber was there. We referred to other people and so on. Lacan is watching overhead. But we did it together. It's our common product. It's not only my product anymore. It is our common product. That, of course, is referring to many postmodern phenomenon in business environment, like, for example, communal thinking. Okay, the managerial boards of companies are all inviting to communal thinking. Internet, Wikipedia is an amazing polyphonic atmosphere where the final text never belongs to one person. It always is a collective productivity. In this modern era, we are much more dialogic compared to the old era. I think I have 10 more minutes. Yeah.
And we have 4 more questions.
Okay.
First, Sabiha Mo.
Hello, Dr. Kerim Balci. I don't know whether I'm able to pronounce your name correctly or not, but I have only 2 short questions to ask. If you look at the life of Bakhtin, you realize that he was a prisoner of war for 12 years, and then he was exiled from Russia because of his work that he did, which was not going well with the so-called, the rulers of the state. My question is, or rather I'm intrigued to just know that why did he so much harped upon dialogue? Is it that 12 years of labor in a slave camp or exile made him so wanting to have a dialogue that he ultimately dedicated a theory of dialogue, and he resisted that monologue should not be the only way of life? My first question is, I'm little, because basically I'm a sociologist, so I'm looking from the part of sociology that does the societal or the environmental elements were responsible to make Bakhtin what Bakhtin was? And number 2, if you say that heterotextuality or heteroglossia is so very important in dialogue, I'm sorry to say, I would like to say about all the religious leaders, they don't engage into this. They have learned something 1400 years ago. I'm a Muslim by faith, so I will only talk about my religion. And if you try to give them an answer which is hyperglossia, or if you give them phony, you said, yeah, if you said, they would immediately label you as kafir. They'll say, oh, you are a kafir because you don't believe in the text. The text cannot change. Text cannot change. Can the interpretation also not be changed? The thing is that, can the dialogue also not be changed? And if dialogue is so very important, then why is it then when we have a dialogue with ourselves, we normally are labeled as mad or psychologically imbalanced or people who do not understand things? In fact, I always feel people who have intra-dialogue with themselves understand things in a better perspective. Thank you very much. That was my query, observation, whatever you say. Thank you.
Ziaul Hassan.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I have also one question. And first of all, I would like to say my thanks to Dr. Kerim for this wonderful philosophical lecture. So I just want to ask that you told about the intertextuality, which is means for the exchange of ideas between the religion, right? So my question is that what your perspective is when this intertextuality means in terms of religious conflict. So how can you correlate this intertextuality in that? Thanks a lot. This is my question.
Now, Vedas, if
Hello.
Yes, Javid.
yes, we can hear you. Please ask
Yes,
your
thank you so much.
question.
First, I would like to thank from Dr. Kerim Balci for giving such a clear lecture. Actually, I had three questions, but two of them are answered by sir. Only I have I would like to hear a brief review regarding heteroglacia. Importance of heteroglacia usually in novels. What is the importance of it? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Javed. Shabista Naz also raised her hand, but I don't see her here, I think. Shabista, are you here? No. Okay, Dr. Balci, over you.
Okay, first of all, to Sabiha Moore's two beautiful questions. The question was Bakhtin's life story as an exiled and put into prisoner camps, and also during his exile in Kazakhstan, he was his right leg was amputated because he was a heavy smoker. So he was actually immobile at that time. He was largely dependent on his wife by means of his contact with the outer world. These are all correct. And your question, of course, enters into a huge discussion of what is the link between the life story of an author and the intellectual product of the author. Many people love to look at Bakhtin's life and take signs or hints about his product, life product. I will say dialogue was already in Bakhtin's writings before 1924 when his problems with the regime started. So Bakhtin had already written Dostoevsky book on crime and punishment, and it is true and true dialogic. Bakhtin's prime production during his prisoner camp and exile years is his PhD thesis on Rabelais' book, where he develops carnival, which we didn't touch. And many, in fact, the carnival was written in order to be presented to a Soviet board of academic competence. So, in my understanding, it does not represent Bakhtin altogether, because he had to do something to pass the PhD. He didn't. He couldn't still, but Bakhtin's Rabelais book is largely Bukhaninian. So it's an anarchistic book. And unfortunately, that was the first book translated into French and then to English. So many people first saw Bakhtin as a Bukhaninian anarchistic literary writer. And when his earlier books showed up, particularly after the 2000s, new Russian texts were found, people were shocked about his credentials of Christianity, Orthodox religious, and his exile is all about his membership to an underground Orthodox religious group. And in 1971-73, he managed to record some radio programs where he referred largely to religious texts, particularly to Bible as dialogic text. In anyhow, dialogue, I think if we are going to add anything from his life to dialogue, his early childhood in Vilnius, now in Ukraine, was actually more formative on Bakhtin's own understanding. Bakhtin grew up in a family where the nana of the family, the servant in the family, was a German lady. So he was fluent in German already as a child. He started reading Goethe at the age of 5 and so on because of the servant in the family. And Vilnius at that time was largely a Jewish city, and Jewish philosophers, particularly German Jewish philosophers, were frequenting Vilnius. So that was the city where Kantian ideas entered into Russian intellectual hemisphere. And I believe that early childhood had rather more impact on Bakhtin. Bakhtin was only 21 when he wrote his first piece, Art and Answerability, where we see, it's only a one-page piece, but we still see tracks of dialogue, intertextuality, and so on in that one page. So already at the early ages of 20, his thought had matured about intertextuality, about dialogue, and so on. And his later written long articles on novel and discourse, also before the exile, completed the dialogue issue. The dialogue issue is completely lost in his exile years, but then they turned back after 1970, particularly in his revoking of the earlier books. He added one chapter to Dostoevsky book and one chapter to Rabelais book. Both of them were kind of an apology for having left dialogue in his exile years. His exile was not completely cut off from the rest of the society in Kazakhstan. He was able to teach at a local university, and he was teaching there also German literature. So in that sense, he continued on his communication, but the link between his early writings and his name was cut off. Nobody knew he was the author of the Dostoevsky book until 1960s. So Bakhtin's life story has all kinds of blanks, missing parts, and that makes Bakhtin even more intriguing. You know, many people claim Bakhtin never graduated from university. He actually used his brother's graduation card in order to find a job and so on. That makes Bakhtin not less than Bakhtin, it makes Bakhtin more than Bakhtin, because it gives us a lot of zone of interpretation. Precisely why I said, missing text, it makes textuality complete. Now, the issue about the lack of heteroglossia or polyphonic manners or virtue in religious communities. That's an unfortunate fact. Since you gave example from the Muslim world, I'm going to elaborate on particularly the Muslim world. Precisely the monologization of Muslim discourse started in 11th century when the Muslim intellectual discourse was having its enlightenment. This was the time Imam Ghazali, who managed to bring together the Greek logic and Islamic sciences together and so on, but he also closed the gates of ijtihad. And after him, we entered into an era of monologic communication. The men of religion took religion into their hands and looked at interpretation as a privileged right of the religious community. And suddenly, what never existed in Islam started to happen. clergy was created. You go to Saudi Arabia or Iran, you will see that Islam has clergy. No? It shouldn't have, but it does. So some people, men of religion, they call themselves ulama, the scientists, knowledgeable persons, think that religion is completely theirs to comment on. It is all their right to understand and explain what God says. And in fact, in my understanding, first of all, it is quite an extravagant position to say that I can understand God. You cannot. You cannot. I can explain. I can accept, but you cannot also. This is God. Unexplainable, ununderstandable. We can only approach, and you can approach. I can approach. Your approach can be better. My approach can be worse. But in the end, that's an approach. But when we look at the Andalusia, for example, the contact with the Christian and Jewish communities in Andalusia created a heteroglossia. That heteroglossia benefited not only the Muslim leaders, but also Judaism and Christianity. Well, the Enlightenment is largely nurtured in Spain with the help of Muslim and Jewish intellectuals. That same aura, atmosphere, created Ibn Arabi, Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi, who is not a standard Orthodox Muslim scholar, certainly introduced a lot of Jewish and Christian monastic concepts into Islam. And yet the same atmosphere also gave fruit in the form of Maimonides, for example, a Jewish commentator. Many people believe the second largest sage of Judaism, who wrote in Arabic and who referred to Avicenna, Ibn Sina, and Farabi as his masters. And he read also Ibn Arabi and so on. And his commentaries in Hebrew Bible was quite a bit influenced by Arabic commentaries of Islam, of the Quran. So that openness to the other was there already. Khuzari was a Jewish rabbi, and the leader of the Andalusian Emirate had a tradition of inviting every week religious scholars into his palace and letting them to discuss on religious issues. And the Khuzari was Jewish, and he was always winning the discussion to the Muslim scholars. But everybody was turning back home. Muslims were not turning into Judaism, and that discussion kept on being done. The leader was Muslim. He was not saying, don't invite this Khuzari, he is good, better than you, and so on. The discussion was continuing on because everybody was learning. Even when I have studied early madrasa books about manners of discussion. They were called in Arabic adab literature. So it was about how to engage into a scientific discussion on a religious or a scientific issue. So it had all kinds of rules out there, but the rule number one was this: if you win the discussion, you lose the discussion. If you lose the discussion, you win the discussion, because when you lose the discussion, you learn something. If you win the discussion, you learn nothing. That was there. Well, we have lost that merit. That virtue is no longer there. I am watching in Arabic sometimes in Egyptian Arabic televisions where Salafi imams and seculars are discussing. The Salafi imam is getting crazy when he is losing the discussion and so on. You are not learning anything. You are not teaching anything even in such cases. Well, the Muslim world is in real monologic situation. In fact, it is by every single day it is becoming more and more monologic. That monologism, Zaman Said Nursi, again very similar to Bakhtin. He lived in exile. He was immobile also. He was pro-dialogue. He was the guy who was the person. In 1954, he sent a book to the Pope inviting for a meaningful dialogue between Christianity and Judaism. The Vatican Council too followed 10 years later to adopt dialogue as a Catholic strategy, and even then they adopted dialogue as a strategy of proselytizing Muslims and other people, Jews and other people. Said Nursi was far ahead of that, and he said the ultimate authoritarianism is the authoritarianism in the university. So the tyranny in politics is nothing compared to tyranny in the university. That starts in the university, in the learning centers. Unfortunately, the tyranny is there. Even in most democratic Muslim countries, like in Turkey, for example, there is an institution called Diyanet. This is the religious directorate, and the Diyanet is there in order to create a monolithic understanding of Islam, so that no different voice is heard. So they publish, for example, books. They say this is Islam. Okay, whichever book says this is Islam is actually destroying Islam. Well, the same is true for Hinduism. The same is true for any other religious tradition. So, well, but in Dialogue Foundation is actually doing quite a good job by means of that. So stay with them, I suggest to you. Ziaul Hassan asked a similar question about, intertextuality and in the context of religious conflicts, how we can use intertextuality. I lived in Israel for 8 years, and we did have an intertextuality group. We were not reading religious texts, but I was bringing Naqshbandi Sufi leaders from Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, together with mystic Jewish rabbis. And we were singing and learning from each other about others' tradition. It is an amazing experience, until you come in meaningful interaction with others. You think that all sincerity stays in your own religion. For example, I will give you an example about dreams. As a Muslim, we attach importance to dreams, particularly if you dream the prophet in your dream, and if you dream, good messages about religion and so on, it is utmost important. For the first time, I met evangelical Christians in Jerusalem, a group of German evangelical Christians and so on. One day they were speaking about their dreams, how Virgin Mary appeared to them in their dreams, and Mary said them something and so on. I saw the illumination on their faces when they spoke about their dreams and so on. And I said, "Do you see Mary coming to you?" And I said, they say, "Yeah, we also dream Jesus," and so on. The first time it came to me as a shock. I said, "Look, if my religion is the truth, it's obvious I can see in my dream my prophet, because it is the perfect prophet, But they see Mary, who is not Mary, okay? They see Mary as Theotokos, the mother of God. They see Jesus as God, not as prophet Jesus. How come this happens? Because dreams is actually the doorway to the unseen, and unseen does not lie. You cannot change unseen because of your subconscious convictions. And I thought so. It doesn't work like that. God doesn't work like that. By the time I realized that when you believe in Christianity or any other religion, God behaves to you in such a way. Okay? That doesn't shock you. But many of us have never had that experience. Because of that, I said India is a chance. There's inescapably lots of different religious traditions are living together for hundreds of years and so on. And secular atmosphere is promising, was promising, let me say at least, up until recently, is promising a fruitful atmosphere where every religious tradition freely can prosper and flourish. It is only under true secular conditions religious traditions can flourish. When any religious tradition is imposed upon other religious traditions or interpretations, it is the end of religious freedom. You are not free in Israel, for example. If you are Jewish, you are not free in Israel. There is an orthodox religious interpretation that is imposed on every Jew. I have Jewish friends, they say, we are free in Iran, but not in Israel. You are not, if you are a Muslim, you are not free in Iran. You have to adapt to the, clergy. But if you are a Christian, you are free in Iran. Okay? Well, you might not be free to build your church, but you are free on how you believe. They don't, give you an authentic Christianity. They say it's your own problem. Well, Islam is my own problem also. It's not the problem of the clergy. By means of religious conflicts, we have done small attempts to bring, Jewish and Christian Palestinian and Muslim Palestinian children together, particularly discussing on issues which seem to be the hot issue, like, for example, this sovereignty of the Temple Mount, meaning Masjid al-Aqsa. Of course, Palestinians say this belongs to the Palestinians, and the Jews say, well, this is the Jewish temple. The same site is the holiest site of three different religions, and you cannot just simply share it. Okay? But intertextuality, or a dialogue, let me say, a creative dialogue, can certainly reach to a position where you can say, okay, it's okay, it all belongs to God. We don't claim sovereignty on holy things. We say this belongs to God. And, well, we can agree on the fact that whenever we say God, we by and large say something not Israeli or not Palestinian. Okay, we might not agree on what is God or who is God, whether Allah and the Elohim of Jews is the same or not, but we can certainly agree what they are not. They are not Israeli. Elohim is not an Israeli God, or Yahweh of Christianity is not necessarily a Roman or Greek God, or Allah is not Muslim. Okay, it's out of our sphere, so we can just give sovereignty to them, to God. I believe that men of religion usually are more open to solution when they come together and speak together. Unfortunately, men of politics, when they use religion, they usurp religion to the utmost end. Israeli political scene is full of Jewish nationalists, racists, who behave as if religious Jews. They're not religious, they're just using religion. Among the Palestinians, I have seen terrorists who do terrorize, who use the religion for their own this worldly ends. Has nothing to do with the hereafter. And I have seen many people who do not even pray daily, but they speak about being martyrs. This is not an overall generalization. I do support Palestinian cause. I have many lovely Palestinian friends who do genuinely want peace in the region. But unfortunately, the same is true also by means of the extremists. As long as the believers of religions do not realize that the other is meant to be there, we are not going to have real peace. But this is not about religion. This is about the fact that the overall understanding of self is corrupt. The overall understanding of others is corrupt. It doesn't corrupt only religion. It corrupts politics. It corrupts economy. The rich people look at the poor people as the other, not as the subjects that are human subjects like themselves, okay? Not as equal in their life. Let me pass to Javid's heteroglossia. He wanted a review of importance in novel. Well, the point is this: heteroglossia is not an aim. Heteroglossia is the uppermost end of polyphony. Bakhtin said polyphony is an aim. Heteroglossia is inescapable. The life is heteroglossic. You cannot escape from multitude of voices. Whenever you hear a voice, it carries a lot of voices behind it. So it is good to be able to listen and hear those voices. But polyphony is a merit in a novel. Polyphony in a novel, or heteroglossia in line, is an atmosphere in a novel where the author of a novel creates heroes in the novel where heroes' sounds are not silenced, where heroes actually are able to freely speak. Of course, you might say, do you mean Raskolnikov himself is going to speak in the book? Who is going to make Raskolnikov speak? Again, the author. So the author is going to play Raskolnikov apart from the author. A beautiful example is Émile Zola. Émile Zola was a very hardworking man, and he actually made this. The book, whenever there was a project of novel in the heroes, he would actually write the story of each and every hero separately. He wouldn't write a novel altogether. He would say, I have 8 different core characters. So he would write the novel from the beginning till the end for each and every character. And only after finishing the novel 8 times, he will bring all 8 novels together and to create a polyphonic novel. This way, he was trying to guarantee that none of the heroes would be diminished into objects. Each one of them would be powerful subjects in the story. Some of the text was missing because you cannot just bring 8 novels together and publish all of them. So most of the things he had written has never been published. But the overall plot of the novel is so strong that even the parts that he didn't publish, you can think about them. You can say, okay, this is This must be this. Dear friends, that is the importance of polyphony in novel. I have something important also. I have to catch within half an hour a meeting in the center of London. And
yes, Dr. Bali, I'm sorry for interrupting. It is nearly 3 hours into our talk, and we have these two people who want to ask questions. So if you can brief a little.
Oh, yeah, I can listen to the question. Whether I can answer them or not, I will see according to the questions.
Okay, so Nita Raghavendra.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Karim. I mean, it was simply amazing. I think you took us to a different level. In fact, today I'm not feeling that scared of Bhaktim. Initially, I was like, no, I had these fears, like hearing those strange words, whether it can be brought to classroom. Now, I teach at a management college, so my issues are a little challenging in the classes. How do I take dialogue or use dialogue as a pedagogical tool in classrooms? Now, after listening to you, it's like, no, each one's understanding, each one of our understandings are at different level. Our state of being is different from what I gather. So when he talks about polyphony, how do I bring it to the classroom? How do I relate or take a student from one level of understanding to another? Because I feel today the entire narrative in India has changed. You know, what was initially like, you talked about polyphony. I mean, at least I believe it's no more like that. The freedom of speech, everything. So how do I actually inculcate these kind of understanding into each and every student, irrespective of what the state of being is?
Thank you. It's a beautiful question. Let us take the second question, and then I am going to say a few words.
Shabista Naz.
Hello. Hello.
Yes,
Am I audible?
Yes, you
Hello.
are. Please.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Balci sir, for a wonderful and insightful presentation. I'll be brief with my question. I just wanted to know, like, there are contradictory meaning or context related to text. So in that case, what is the possibility of dialogue? Like, for example, in case, Muslims use the term jihad in a very different context, and the mass media, or like the popular understanding of jihad is entirely different. So in that context, when we are talking about jihad to a non-Muslim, how we are going to initiate a dialogue when these are two different understanding of different people? Can you like give some ideas on that?
Shabista, thank you.
Well, if you can,
we don't have any question, yeah?
We don't have more questions.
First of all, there are several, well, when I say several, hundreds of studies about pedagogic implications of Bakhtinian concepts. And I have studied a few of them, particularly written about Bulgaria, where Turkic-speaking students and Bulgarian-speaking students are studying in the same classroom, and teachers are having it difficult to, communicate at the same time to the two different linguistic groups and cultural groups and so on. How polyphony can actually be a positive input in such atmosphere. For example, in one of those papers, the teachers, the managers of the school adopted the strategy of having two teachers for one class who can speak both languages. And in fact, children started to love the idea of hearing Turkish. Bulgarian students started to love the idea of hearing some Turkish words, and the vice versa. Suddenly, the other enriched the other students. The Bulgarian students turned back to their houses with some Turkish songs, for example, and the vice versa. Now, this came after an era of persecution of minority linguistic groups in Bulgaria. Turkish language was banned at all, and still many Bulgarian families would find it difficult to attach an equality to the Turkish language or Turkish students when it comes to their own children and so on. That is not an easy task. But in India, the situation is the opposite. You know, the richness was there; it is being lost. Then it's always easier to turn back to the original richness if we are persistent and resilient on our insistence on the heteroglossic nature of Indian society. There had been, you know, when you say management, you know, I was thinking about studies of managerial boards of decision making, where minority sounds are silenced by way of monologic strategies. You know, the chairman of the executive board comes to the meeting and already with an closed, sealed agenda, he has already given the decisions actually, and he does not need ideas, he needs approval. And he, of course, in order to take that approval, he seems to be deciding as, you know, asking them their ideas. But in fact, he's not asking ideas, he's just asking for signature. He's saying, this is what I'm doing, just you agree. And this, by time, alienates many of the members of the executive boards, and they stop speaking. They know that their ideas are not taken serious, and so this happens in primary school conditions also. You know, the children, usually there is an authoritative relationship between a teacher and a child, because we usually sit in a higher place. This is mainly a Eastern strategy. The teacher is taller, inescapably, and the teacher walks in between the tables, and that authoritative status, power, communication, the powerful status of teacher is obviously there. When you speak to a child, you look at him or her from a top, and already creates an inner cruciation, and the child knows that the teacher can punish, and that authority usually silences the voice of the child. Well, silencing a classroom is something desired, but silencing one child in a classroom is mobbing. Silencing the imaginative faculty of a child is discrimination, is even more problematic. Now, I have seen here, for example, a strategy of not using tables. Unfortunately, during COVID era, they turned back to tables, but children are sitting on the ground, and the teacher is sitting on the ground also. Teachers never speak to the children while standing. They sit on the ground, just like the children, so the power relation is equal. They look at the same level. And that first of all, suddenly created an atmosphere of dialogue. I have seen BBC has been doing amazing programs about, you know, bringing children together at the age of 7, 8, and giving them tasks about, you know, highly sophisticated tasks. Like, for example, an ethical question. They say, we have £1,000. We are going to give this nation. We have 3 options. One is a lady who has a cancer and he needs this money in order to have an operation. One is for the children in a war-ridden zone, and one is for you know, your friends who are launching a birthday party and so on. Discuss together, you know, at the age of 8 5 children are discussing among themselves. They are filming this, and suddenly we see children actually quite imaginative, and they care quite a bit about others and so on compared to elderly people, you know. But if it is genuine, in my country, Turkey, there is a day called Children Festival on the 23rd of April. There's a tradition of each and every upper position in the government to be left to a child. So the president leaves his space to a child, the speaker of the parliament leaves his space to a child, prime minister also, and so on. And those children become president for one day, prime minister for one day, and so on. But everything is already given to them, what to do and what to write, what to say, and so on. Everything is memorized. Of course, everybody is afraid that that child is going to do something crazy. Well, they don't have the right to sign anything. You know, they are afraid that the child is going to criticize the president, or afraid that the child is going to criticize the education system and so on. That fear is in itself a monologic fear. You know, we have to overcome that. You know, I'm working with young people, usually at the ages of 14 to 24, on human rights activity. And of course, our human rights activity is largely, well, because of COVID-19, we are no longer protesting in the streets, but it's about shouting, you know. And these young people are quite modest people and so on, and they have never got used to shouting in front of elderly people. And I'm saying, just shout at me, not necessarily, you know, in a conflicting manner. Just, I want to hear your voice, maximum voice, and so on. But it is difficult. But when I convinced them to join a protest in the streets of London, when I leave them together with their friends, they start to learn to act. I think this is a process. You know, it cannot be done in one single classroom in one single day. Most probably they are going to say, are you joking us? The teacher is just playing us, you know, she wants to see who is going to be crazy and so on. I remember I was trying to employ an assistant, and I invited for interview several people, and you know, I gave them a task. You know, we are going to prepare a project about a human rights issue. You know, we need to write the project. I have this and that idea. What do you think? And whoever says this is a perfect idea, I say, okay, I will call you later on. One of them I liked very much. He was quite clever and so on, but still he insisted I like the idea. And I said, I don't want you to like the idea. I want you to say your own idea. And he said, you don't want to work with me. You're just trying to make me, you know, speak my own idea, and then you're going to just, no, I said, no, I want to hear your idea. Now, the point is, in Eastern cultures, we usually stop children to speak their ideas. And then at the age of 20s, 25s, we expect them to have ideas. Okay? It doesn't happen like that. It has to start in the early ages. The overall education system has to be, you know, pedagogically tried. But you can certainly, instead of changing revolutionary everything, you can certainly make games of polyphony, for example. You know, like for example, we can say, look, children, today from your home to the class, you have heard several voices. Let us detect to what social class or to what linguistic group those voices belong to, and respect to all of them. It might be a voice of a bazaar seller, it might be the voice of a milkman, which is certainly different. Your mother has a different voice, your sister has a different voice, because they are different sociological categories and so on. Your teacher speaks in a different manner. A Muslim or a Sikh or a Hindu has different accent and so on. So these are all voices. that we need to detect and respect. This is the richness of our society. Then we can make games about them. You know, a polyphony class, for example, children can actually use different voices and love those voices. And my daughter is, for example, every week she comes home with a different American or Australian accent and so on. If she was French, she would speak English with this way and so on. She makes fun of it, but she also, by way of listening to that, she realizes the multitude of voices in the background. In fact, many of the voices in our own religious texts belong to other religions. You know, the Islamic texts altogether resonate with Jewish, Christian, Assyrian background. But you have to listen to that and you have to respect that. We do have lots of stories, you know, saintly stories that moved from religion to religion. You know, the Muslims believe that there is a stone in Jerusalem called the rising stone that actually wanted to follow the Prophet Muhammad during his ascension to the sky. The same story is told in Christian circles, and this was told even before Islam. So it is certainly a Christian story that entered into Islam after the lifetime of the Prophet. Okay, this doesn't make the story less valuable. It is a story. No, it's not history. It's a story. Okay, and it means that we take something and give back and so on. This is the richness of religious traditions, but it needs a lot of openness to get used to that, to get used to, you know, to understanding the give and take between different religions. Now, we did have no more question, yeah? Or shall we start?
Yes, we don't have any more questions.
No. If I missed the answers, I do apologize, and I wish you all the success, and I hope this is going to reach to a perfect result, and I hope some of you at least will decide to read a bit of Bakhtin. Bakhtin is not the end in itself. Certainly you may go for Kristeva, for example, a Marxist interpretation of Bakhtin, but woman feminist interpretation of Bakhtin, which is rich in content. Thank you very much for your time and for your patience. Have a nice day.
Thank you very much, Dr. Balci, for this very, very enlightening and a comprehensive talk. I look forward to seeing you in coming lectures. Thank you